We are live right now at Jamstack Conference. Oh, this is fun. Oh my gosh, this has been such a great time. We have with us Alex, who's going to be joining us here with Uniform and several other people actually. Tanner Lindsley, maybe David Price might be making a show here, maybe Tom Price Warner, who knows, he may appear, may not. I did talk to him earlier. But we've got many folks, Facundo from Storyblock. We've got so many great people here that are going to be hopefully joining us here shortly as we continue this. We were going to try and do this down. They got like a DJ booth going on right now downstairs on the second floor. We're on the third floor actually right now near the rooftop, considered quote unquote the rooftop. And we got lots of awesome things going on. Let me add Alex as a speaker. There we go, if he's not already. Brad is listening in. Brad, dude, it is for you, man.
Yeah.
It's like 2 a.m. I know you, or something like that. You said that it was going to be like the middle of the night. Thanks for jumping on. I totally understand if you can't talk because maybe people are sleeping. But yeah. So welcome to JavaScript Jam live at Jamstack Conference. And this is where normally we do this every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. But we like to do these conferences and go live at the conferences, right? And so that's why we're doing it Tuesday, because this is the last day of the conference. And there's an awesome blog podcast out, or you feel like you're missing out, having a little FOMO, don't worry. We're going to let you in on all the fun here with all these people that are going to be coming in and talking and listening in. All right, Alex and Ishan, I'm going to give it up to you guys here in just a second. I just want to say, if you are just now joining us for the first time, just know that, hey, Ishan, I don't know if you want to mute unless this is a lot of background noise right now until come in. Thank you. Awesome. If you're here for the first time, we just want to say we welcome everybody to speak up here, whether you're a beginner at this or you've been doing this for a very long time. And what I mean by that is developing. We want to hear from you. Okay. In fact, that's how we get like the most out of these conversations and have the most value and fun together, is when everybody joins in and asks questions or gives their opinion or whatever it might be. We want to hear from you. And now I'm going to give it up to our awesome co-host, Ishan, and welcome Alex as well to the room. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Scott. It is great to be here. This has been a really exciting and interesting conference. We're up here on the third floor. They're actually taking down the booths, so there's little background noise, and it's mighty chilly here at the venue, surprisingly, because this was supposed to be actually where the rooftop party was going to be. They moved it downstairs because of the weather, but it's been a great conference. And one of the speakers was Alex from Uniform. And Alex, thanks for joining us on JavaScript Jam.
Hey guys, how's it going? Can you hear me okay? It's my first Twitter space here, so I'm a bit confused.
No,
we can hear you just
you're
fine.
Already, yeah.
All right, sweet.
You're actually ahead of the game. We've learned that Twitter Spaces for the first time can be confusing. Number one recommendation is if you want to speak, you should make sure you join via a mobile device. Otherwise, if you try to join from the web, you can't actually speak. So you're already doing great.
Mobile first, yeah. That's very anti-Jamstack. No web platform present. What's going on?
It really is, especially considering the closing remarks we saw in the last hour, where it was the web is fun again. The web is great again. Yeah. Hopefully they'll roll it out.
We need to speak to the manager. Who runs this platform?
Yeah, I know. Who might be in charge? They're listening. But let's turn back to the conference. You're one of the speakers. I want to get to your talk, which I tweeted out. I was very much aligned with a lot of what you were talking about. But first of all, before we jump into what you guys were talking about, actually introduce yourself and who Uniform is, and then I want to get your impressions on the conference itself, and then let's talk about the theme of your presentation.
Yeah, sure, gladly. My name is Alex Shyba. I'm co-founder and CTO of Uniform, and I'm a full-stack developer. I started with .NET back in the day, ASP.NET. That's how I got into web. And then TypeScript was my gateway into JavaScript. I kind of went from C# through TypeScript to JavaScript. Yeah, that was my short journey. I've been spending a lot of time in the Jamstack land and working with some enterprise customers to activate Jamstack for them in various capacities, trying to figure out how to have Jamstack their way, sometimes on their own infrastructure or their own VN. So that's been fun, trying to make it happen and realizing the power of Jamstack optimized platform while I was doing it, making it so easy. Then when you're trying to do it outside, Yeah, that's why we love Jamstack optimized platforms. So that's my experience and pushing kind of the edge side shenanigans with our own SDK and making personalization A/B testing work on edge functions or edge handlers or edge workers, whatever you call them. That's been fun over the past couple of years to see various generations of edge compute working together with static and observing this kind of fusion of static and dynamic, and it's really exciting. Yeah, so that's got at Uniform with the forefront of edge side personalization, but doing all sorts of other stuff with composable platforms and yeah,
Yeah,
carving out new space.
there's a couple of things I actually want to unpack there. The first one actually is you said people who want to do Jamstack their way or on their infra. Maybe for the audience who may not have experience in like a large enterprise, contextualize why somebody might do that instead of going with one of the soup to nuts platforms.
Yeah, it's a journey for many enterprise IT teams, right? So they invested heavily in their Akamai, for example, and they are playing around with the next gen deployment platforms that kind of more Jamstack friendly. So it's a journey to get there for many, but they like the idea of fundamental principles of Jamstack. So figuring out a incremental pathway from where they are now to the future. That's been a challenging undertaking. Can you run Jamstack on Azure, for example, or on Tencent in China? We had an interesting project making it work, and you realize how much more you need to do. While it's all possible, but you need to figure out where you run your builds. How do you invalidate cache yourself? So that's you realize how much mechanics needed to make Jamstack work, but it's exciting to kind of look at it from a low level perspective and gain appreciation for Jamstack optimized platforms this way.
Yeah, there's so much that a Jamstack platform does for you that you don't. It's almost easy to take it for granted how simple and easy they can. We once mapped it out, and when we were done mapping it out, it was like 20 different services on AWS you'd have to stitch together yourself in order to get an out of the box Jamstack platform. And unfortunately, in an enterprise context, you might be wedded to half of those 15 or 10 have already been chosen for you, and you might have to build the rest out.
Yep.
So the other thing you talked about was edge computing and edge runtimes. And I would say probably the biggest theme here today at the conference, today and yesterday, was, I would say, edge computing and edge runtimes was a really popular one. There's talks on databases on the edge. I would say that was probably like one of the most dominant themes. If you were to pick for the listener what you walked away from this conference as the top, say, 2 or 3 themes you think that were in the air, in the ether here, what jumps out at you that you think and reflect back on the last 2 days was a popular theme, either on stage or in the hallway track for you?
Yeah, I think the edge programmability layer is definitely interesting, and seeing the adoption of serverless, the numbers that Laurie shared, gives me belief that the edge functions as the next evolution of that will be picked up rather quickly, since serverless is getting a lot of attention and adoption comparing with previous years. Those Jamstack survey numbers were really interesting. So I think I'm excited to see where this is going and what interesting applications can be built powered by this. We spent some time, we actually had a workshop on that on Monday, 3 hours, where we were hacking around with functions and doing all sorts of transformations there. So combining static and dynamic. So we have post-static generation transformation of HTML. We have some SDKs for that, but you can do a lot with if you have some ad hoc requirements towards that. So I'm excited where this is going and what other things you can do. You have Dino runtime at your disposal, and you can do anything you want. But like, where are the boundaries, and whether we're gonna have emerging patterns, best practices from that, what to do, what not to do with edge functions. That's uncharted waters for many, but I think because it's so integrated and so easy to start, I think it'll be the uptake will definitely be there. And the next question is how you manage state with all of that, right? Because stateless edge compute is almost easy. I don't want to say easy, but much
Yeah.
easier than stateful compute. So how does this work with when you have user session, you have application state? That's where you need some sort of fast persistent layer, and this is where I think a lot of talk is where is it going and what is the data story there.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. For all the talk on the optimism of the edge, I feel like there was a lot of realism in the sense that we heard from, I think it was during the Edge Runtimes panel, multiple times people brought up the moment you have to go to a database at an origin from
Hmm.
your Edge function to get the piece of data in order to personalize or render or whatever you have to do, you've basically defeated the whole purpose of the Edge. So we have to get the data there. And I was impressed there was a panel specifically on that, on
Hmm.
databases and the edge. I thought that was really forward looking, and I thought that was really good they included that in there. Were there any other themes that jumped out? Sorry, the serverless one I think was a really good call out too, because I feel, especially with what we're seeing, is serverless, the interface for a developer to serverless and to edge functions is very similar, and so it feels like a easy stepping stone from one to the other. So I think what Lori showed in terms of serverless adoption, it bodes well for edge, but it means that
Hmm.
any type of edge platform needs to effectively be serverless type, let's say, like in terms of an abstraction and compatible. Like you won't have to think about the infrastructure, just give us the function and we execute it. I think that's one of the
Yep.
lessons there. Were there any other things that jumped out from you from at attending the conference or speaking at it that you thought was an interesting theme that emerged, or anything that surprised
I
you?
think the format was interesting. There was a lot more kind of group discussions and knowledge sharing from thought leaders in the community. That was fresh, I think. And going into the depth there, you don't always get to experience it. I think the just seeing friends or people you've interacted virtually over last couple years, that
Oh yeah,
I
that's
mean
huge.
that was the highlight, obviously.
Oh yeah,
um,
that I'm glad you brought that up. I almost forgot about that. That was a huge benefit. I multiple times. Actually, you and I have met virtually before we met physically here. There are people who walked up to me, like Bud Parr from the New Dynamic. It was like I had to realize, oh, we've never met in person, but we've interacted so. Like we went through, we'd be like, oh wait, yeah, this is our first time meeting in person. We just hadn't been used to it. So that's a really good call out. Sorry, keep going.
yeah, no, it's definitely it's also first time speaking in a few years. So reasoning with that, also that speaking anxiety, that was familiar feeling that I forgot. So kind of reliving that was quite something. It's always being a tech guy is not my nature, doing public speaking. So that was a good challenge to shake things up a little bit and get into the groove and get into the right flow and have a 20 minute on stage. That's lose that if you don't do this often. So since we
Yeah.
had that couple years of conference pause, then you need to retrain yourself in those skills, as well as just networking, mingling skills. That's also getting rusty. So kind of
Yeah.
getting like through that those interesting experiences. Though it's not my first conference, it was the first time speaking in a while. That was a rush,
Yeah, you're
definitely.
right. It's riding a bicycle again, except you're like, oh, wait, I'd forgotten what this was like. But I think that's a good seg into the talk that you gave on the modern digital pipeline. The future of Jamstack is composable. Do you want to, and people can go tune in and see a lot of the Jamstack conference videos online, including yours. But do you want to first start up by giving the audience just an overview on what you talked about? And then I'd like to dig in on a few themes you had.
Yeah, this was actually Tim Bennick's talk, but he couldn't make it because of COVID, so I took over. But of course, we worked together on shaping the vision of what we think is the next wave of headless composable architectures, but going a little bit beyond that, why composable matters and how do we actually make composable work and make it mainstream. I think there's a lot of talk in the ecosystem around composable, but everybody understands composable differently. We look at it as a true open composable approach where you can built architecture, following the Unix principles of best of breed libraries that are great at what they do and composing them into one cohesive architecture. And you can swap out components easily without really tearing everything down and starting from scratch. So when we imagine a project of enterprise scale, there's always more than just a CMS and a front end. There is some other sources of content. And if we imagine the world where there is no central content repository, as in the prior decade, we tried to shove everything into CMS, including your place to run your API, place to bring your commerce integrations, place to bring your digital asset management integration, search, and then your CMS becomes huge monolith. We don't want to repeat those architectural mistakes from the past. I mean, it may work on some scale, but in order for this to be sustainable for larger use cases, composable architectures is the answer. And the evolution of headless is leading us to what we think is a new category, and this is what Gartner identified as digital experience composition. So I introduced that concept and how we implementing a DXC solution with Uniform, where you can combine all sources of content, even on a single component. You can have copy coming from one headless CMS, media coming from digital asset management, like a cloud. You could have search API powering other parts of your component, maybe a product catalog or PIM. So that's the new world order of distributed content. There should be a layer that brings it all together, but not just as an API aggregator, but as a tool that also brings non-developers into the room and makes them productive so they can assemble page level content without developer involvement. So this is where that composition level management or assembly layer is really important, where you have universal preview, you have ability to edit in context, you can have ability to personalize or A/B test different components in line. So this is the promise of this digital experience composition category, a product category that we play in it. So wanted to introduce that in terms of which problems it is solving and what could be the solution. And also was a good chance to introduce turbotutorials.dev, which is what Tim Bennett has been building as a lighthouse project of what a DXC solution could look like, with latest Knox 3, with edge function-based personalization delivery, with content from multiple sources, multiple headless CMSs, and search. So that project is all about multiple tutorials that can help developers kind of get started and learn all of this new cutting edge web stuff. That was an opportunity to also share this with the community. Yeah, so that's the premise of the talk.
Yeah, so first off, we should throw out that URL again. It was turbotutorials-dev, is that correct? I'm trying to find it again.
Turbotutorials.dev.
Turbotutorials.dev with a dash in between turbo and tutorials, correct?
It works with or without the dash.
Oh, it does. Okay. It does. You're right. I have it in my browser with the dash. Okay. And that's Tim's site. Again, speaking of meeting people in person, I was really looking forward to Tim meeting. Unfortunate that he got sick. Tim, we love you. One of the things that I think was really great about what you're talking about here with DXC and that you called out is something that I feel has been brewing for a while. And I remember talking about this with somebody, I think it was somebody from actually SpeedCurve back in the very first Jamstack conference. And that's this fact that as developers, the Jamstack feels great. We get to put all these pieces together. We get this great assembly. But for content editors, for the people who aren't developers, it can be a nightmare. It certainly was a few years ago when we didn't have tooling to support the content creation. And one of the things I remember we talked a lot about is that sites are built as much by the developer as by the non-developer. Like the people putting content in the site are building the site as much as the developer is. So I think it's really great. Like that when did Gartner actually start coining the DXC category?
That's fairly recent, I think a couple months ago.
Okay. And I think that's real progress that people finally are going to start recognizing this. I do feel like you guys are part of this group that are helping the Jamstack be more, I don't know what the right word is. I don't want to use like a loaded term, like more inclusive of non-developers, but it's definitely, I think, making it easier for people to manage the stack and giving that composable, let me piece things together just as much as developers enjoy it. I think non-developers enjoy that as well too. One of the other things
absolutely. I
you
think,
had, oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I just want to add to it. I think it's our responsibility to make Jamstack more appealing and understandable to non-developers as well. And you're right, we need to be striving for a balanced approach where it should be unreasonable for an author to wait for 5 minutes for the build to finish to see the changes. So I'm excited to see all the incremental Jamstack progress. I'm excited to see that the edge rendering and streaming as an option, which unlocks SSR, but at the edge as well, right? Which should completely eliminate that waiting stage of and content change and publish. There's also a lot of what's referred to as publishing anxiety in the content authoring among content authors in headless space specifically, because there's not often clear what's going to happen if I change and publish this particular content object.
Yeah.
How does this impact my pages? Is this going to show up on 500 pages or just one page? Because there is no head, there is no really any reference to a piece of content because it's all in code. So there's a lot of challenges there as folks. The next wave of adoption coming from the monolithic CMSs from prior decades, there's certain expectations that these folks are coming into this new stacks with, right? And I think it's our job to make this transition easier for them. There is no publishing anxiety. There is no wait times. They're used to instant publishing pretty much, and I need to restore that balance. And yeah, scale performance is important, but also business user productivity and giving them tools so they can manage web experiences in context, making sure they can personalize, individualize web experiences if they wanted to in context. So that kind of the capabilities they used to need to work with all the modern stacks and modern tooling. That's what we believe in, and that's what we're trying to make happen at Uniform. But we also see a lot of folks doing amazing things on that, bridging that gap, and headless CMS is also evolving. Nothing is static. Kind of playing on the Jamstack. Nothing is static here, and seen so many demos from folks having booths and doing presentations, like just amazing pace of innovation in this space. And it's interesting to see these gaps being closed very quickly.
I really like that publishing anxiety as a term to describe it. And that description of really this is marrying the expectations they have from a monolithic platform, but just delivering it to them in a headless context. That's a great way to explain it. We're at the halfway point. Scott, I'll let you do our station break and remind folks that like what we like to do for the second half is open it up to the audience. Feel free to raise your hand and comment or ask a question about the conference or anything else that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Appreciate it so far. This has been great. Thank you, Ishan and Alex, for joining us during this. It's been such a fun time. So amazing. If you're just now joining us for this, know that we do this normally on Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So anytime you want to join up with us and listen in and also contribute and or partake in this and JavaScript Jam, you can feel free to do so every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you're a beginner or maybe you've been doing this for a really long time, being a developer, that is, it doesn't matter. We'd love to hear from everybody. In fact, that's how some of our amazing conversations happen during this time, is when everybody participates. So feel free to request to come up here. We'll be more than happy to bring you up if you have any questions for Alex or Ishan or myself and want to ask those questions and or just state an opinion or whatever you want. We would love to hear from you. Thank you guys so much. And now moving on to the second half of the show. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. One of the things, and I'll just encourage people again, feel free to raise your hand. And if you want to get any type of firsthand view of the conference, we're happy to answer those questions. Raise your hand at any time. But one of the things, getting back to your talk, Alex, you had this slide that said, why use the Jamstack? Everything is now API first. The magic happens on the CDN. the meaning of Jamstack is changing. I'm going to interpret that to really just capture this edge theme of being in the air. The old definition of Jamstack was entirely very much static. It feels. Do you feel like this new generation of or an approach to what we've been talking about in terms of DXC, in terms of being able to deliver for content editors the same level of authoring, would have been possible in the old static paradigm? Is the edge an enabler there, or do you think it could have been done without?
That's a great question. I think it's definitely an enabler to get it done right. There's been workarounds, I think, to even for incremental Jamstack, we had to build our own incremental static generation as a kind of Next.js extension because we needed Jamstack to scale and have this on-demand page regeneration. When one page changes in CMS, we would skip the process and regenerate only one page. So that was workarounds we had to build before it's now possible with the framework, right? And with CDN platform natively. And sometimes you have to do it like on some old school CDN because this is what particular customer is using and they stuck with it for maybe a couple of years before they can evaluate other options. So you need to, but they want Jamstack to work, right? So you need to find these creative solutions. But I think I hope many will join me in this, that it's better just to use the platform and just focus on building other stuff rather than building these workarounds and stretching Jamstack further. But it was fun, but I'd love to do other things. And I think the dynamic component, like the ability to combine static and dynamic is really interesting until edge rendering, and which requires fast data or fast content. If you don't have fast content, like edge rendering also is probably not the best option. So until that becomes reality for many, this kind of combination of static plus dynamic transformations, lightweight transformations, that's an interesting approach to stretch Jamstack further. So business users do not miss out on A/B testing or personalization that runs natively without like conflicting with your virtual DOM and fighting with your virtual DOM, making it work the way it's intended, right? Together, compatible with React or Vue-based frameworks. That I think becomes possible with this edge worker, edge function, edge handler, edge middleware layer, and I think that stretches us in ultimately being able to render everything at the edge eventually. I think this is where it's going, but there's also a case to be made about the right tool for the job. I think Matt touched on that on stage because we shouldn't forget about this magic form and ask ourselves, do we really need this? Maybe old school SSR works for this particular use case or project? But the fact that you have so many options, how to render, where to render, it's great, but it's also requires you to pause and think before architecting something and really find the best option. But yeah, I think it's definitely easier now and you have more and more options at your disposal, but I'm not sure if it's gonna consolidate around edge rendering or not, or we're gonna end up having 3-4 options to choose from for a few years down the road. Probably.
It does seem like there's a collection, sometimes a confusing collection when you include the unique ones in the frameworks, like ISG and ISR. You seem very diplomatic as to what you think the future is going to be. Is that you're being diplomatic, or you're open to all of them, or do you have a prediction or a preference? You think are you like, I think it would probably, I don't know, 80% certainty will all converge around rendering at the edge, or you think it's going to be this has to be taken apart and different use cases render different places?
I think it's predicated on whether you can solve the fast content layer problem. If you can deliver content at 50 millisecond, you can spend another 50 millisecond rendering that content. That I think works. But if your content APIs is too slow and there's not much you can do about it, right? Jamstack has always been that savior doing build time as much as possible, right? Like hiding that cost of the first cold request. So that's I think dependent on the maturity in the content API space. If you're already caching your content at the edge, then edge side rendering is probably gonna get you very far and you don't have to do any static builds anymore. But for some project, it might be even use case based or path based or route based, right? Some routes can be pre-rendered statically, other routes may be rendered on demand. And then you have maybe a path that is user session specific that you'll always have to server-side render. And where you do server-side render will depend on where's your user data. Is that geo-distributed? It's one thing. If it's in one data center in US East 1, then you probably want to do that server-side rendering closer to where data is stored. So that's where complexity in the architectures will play into. When we start looking into the best option, we'll have to ask a lot more questions, and that's the right thing to do anyways. But having those multiple options is better than you have to do static for everything. We know it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And now we have more options at our disposal. So I'm not sure if there's ever going to be a universal way, but yeah, it's all dependent if geo-distributed data or state will be so universally available.
Yeah.
But that's such a difficult problem to solve. I'm not sure if we're going to get there
Yeah.
soon.
The scaling compute, if you think about the evolution here, like scaling compute was actually the easier problem. It took us a while to just get that to the edge. Scaling data is going to be the real linchpin there. And you're right, we had a panel where they made this point, like maybe for some use cases, you actually want to be running functions, some cases at the edge. Maybe you want to run it super close to the data than you already are, like in the database. And it's like food for thought there. But we've got Anthony who just came up to the stage. Anthony, let's give you a chance to speak.
Yo. Yeah, sorry, I was just curious. You have some sort of mesh-like thing for Uniform, and this is a very niche thing, I think, for some people, but I actually worked at a company that built, I think, something exactly like this. So I'd be curious, can you talk about Mesh's smart grid and like how that fits into the composability?
Definitely. So our approach is to build Mesh not just for developers, but also for content architects or practitioners, that they can build Mesh integrations with like REST API, any REST API themselves without a developer. So essentially configuring an endpoint and then bringing it into your view model. So essentially a structural component in our case becomes a consumer of that mesh integration. So let's say you want to bring in Unsplash images into your site. You can configure integration, and then the array of images could come into your component props. So you will essentially map the output of a mesh integration into the component prop that's modeled inside of our component library, and then
That
becomes
makes sense, but
an activation layer.
Usually when I'm hearing about a mesh, it's usually more so like multiple different things that are being combined together in some sort of way. And I think this is interesting because
Is anybody else having trouble
usually...
hearing Alex, or is it just me?
No, I can hear. Sorry, go ahead, Anthony.
Weird.
Yeah, sorry, my bad. Didn't talk to you. Didn't mean to. Yeah, I was just saying that the mesh thing is, I hear it referred to in GraphQL kind of way, but it sounds like what you're saying is it's not GraphQL.
In our world, it doesn't have to be, and GraphQL actually makes things more complicated for us because we're dealing with trees of arbitrary depth, and this is where GraphQL is not
Where can I find
fantastic
docs
at.
on this? I'm trying to find it on your website.
Yeah, it should be under docs.uniform.app.
Cool. Yeah, sorry to hijack, but yeah, so I want to see like code examples because it's like it's a really interesting thing because you're building a mesh in a very different way, but it's accomplishing a similar solution. So I think a lot of the other meshes are doing this Netlify graph and take shape and like in steps and all of those. They're all GraphQL meshes, but they like the pictures, the 5 services you have in the little blocks on your front page is the same 5 services all of us have.
Yeah, our approach is different in the way that we want to bring the output of mesh into your component and have it be configurable without development effort. So think about it as If you see a page, you see a few components, the structural part of that page, what goes into components, this is something we want to facilitate non-technical folks to create and own, and then be, so the component, we call them parameters, as that binding gate into an individual element from any source API. So you can connect title from a hero component to a field called copy in Contentful, image to an asset in Cloudinary. So using component and props as the way to manifest how the mesh binds into your application. If that makes sense.
So the thing that that makes sense. The only thing I'm confused on that is basically like, are they hitting an endpoint? Is the endpoint hidden from them? Like, at what point does that stuff actually get connected and get into their component, and how much of that is actually away?
Yeah, it's all abstracted away. You actually have two options. One is have our mesh do the data fetching and final assembly of content for you. So you just ask for page data and you get a post-assembled data that is cached at the CDN level. Another option is for you to actually plug in what we call enhancers. These are kind of pieces of SDK that will be responsible for the final assembly. And this is where you can fine-tune how you want to data fetch from a given data source. Will give you some optimistic implementation, but you can be fine-tuning the mechanics of how mesh operates. And then you can deploy it yourself somewhere on the server and own that piece if you want to. So I have two models of operation. The next gen mesh that we actually revealing next week is gonna be more of a automagical and everything is taken care of for you. So we'll give you Edge cacheable API endpoint, you ask for page data and you get everything that's on the page already fetched, mapped, and ready to go.
Gotcha. And I did find it. It's docs.uniform.app/tutorials, and they have a bunch of stuff with it. Yeah, no, this is super cool.
Yeah, so let me repeat back to see if I've understood correctly. Basically, what you've described is that whereas a developer might, Anthony's question was, developer might try to query something like OneGraph or some service like that aggregates a bunch of APIs together, but the developer is the one specifying what all the different services are that they've asked through their GraphQL query, all the ones they want stitched together. And instead, what happens here is the developer just asks for page data, maps it into components, and inside Uniform, the non-technical stakeholder can decide how things map together into that page data and easily swap it in and out. And all the developer does just knows that they got page data, but not what all the different, whether it's 1 or 10 different services put together, power that data. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah, we want that information architect to drive that decision, for them to own that boundary, that content configuration boundary. So use configuration versus code for that. And we believe that's what's gonna make this project scale. So we have folks that coming from enterprise content management systems, they understand components, they understand modeling, information architecture. We want to make sure they are productive in our system as well. So developers can focus on the front end. They get data they need to render. Things become simpler. All you need is bring your own render function. And then information architects are setting all the content plumbing. So everything, of course, you can still do, if you want to throw together an API and then call it from your front end. If it's not page data, something outside of page data, you have search index to call, maybe some other endpoint. It can coexist with page data, but everything that is the web experience, that will be taken care of by this mesh component.
And you said you've got an announcement next week. Do you want to just tease that one again? And how do people tune into that? I know it looks like you got a webinar coming, I think next week. Is that where you're announcing it?
Yes, November 15th. We have 6 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern. You go to uniform.dev/DXCA-assembly. And I believe we have announcement bar on our main uniform.dev website in the header.
Yep, I see it there.
Yeah, so it's gonna be just a couple of hours sort of event where we're gonna showcase everything we've been working on, make some announcement, have some customer story, success stories there. So should be fun. Hopefully you can join. It's gonna be all virtual, and yeah, we are very excited about it.
Yeah, sounds exciting. And then I assume if you can't catch all of it, the recording will also be available. But folks, go ahead and register. I'm doing it right now. 6 a.m. Pacific time or 9 a.m. Eastern time on November 15th. Definitely check it out. How do you feel DXC overlaps with, say, no code? Would you feel like that's a fair comparison or not? Is that not an accurate kind of, is it comparison to no code tools and platforms? It feels like it's no code just for the UI layer to a certain extent or the data mapping layer, but what do you feel like there's an overlap there, or is that not a decent analogy in terms of the DXC category, not necessarily uniform in particular?
Yeah, I think no code is a characteristic of DXC as a piece. I think it extends headless and it makes headless more of a no code capable architecture, in my view. But there is a lot more to DXC than that. I think it consists of multiple components and API aggregation, orchestration, the visual in context editing, presentation, service. And our version of it also includes edge personalization integrated. So there's a few other components included. And yeah, I'm sure that this is still very new space, and it'll be marinated for a while, and we'll see what the universally adopted version of this is gonna be. But definitely, low code or no code is a big important aspect to it because it's meant to enable non-technical folks and bring them together on this Jamstack headless composable journey.
What of those things you mentioned is not, I guess, in the official Gartner definition? Is A/B testing in there or not? I'm just out of curiosity. And how do they pitch it against, say, DXPs, the digital experience platforms? How do they compare and contrast that?
Yeah, in our version of DXC, personalization A/B testing is included, but I don't think it's in the Gartner's definition. To us, this is such an integral part of composition, and by eliminating this be a separate piece, we also want to challenge this phase 2 convention that is known in our space, where personalization has always been a phase 2 dream and it never comes. So by bringing it a little bit closer to the beginning of the project, where when you do content planning, you can do initial assembly, it's there and it can be activated at one click of a button. To us, that's very important, and we want to make sure it's easier to get started with, and it's more, and you can invest more into it, and it's crawl, walk, run approach rather than you need to do a lot of upfront planning, making sure your infrastructure scales to handle server-side personalization, because it just throws so many new wrenches at your problem. But because of CDN and edge-side delivery, you don't need to worry as much about it, because CDN will take care of that. So that means that all you need to do is making sure it's fully integrated as first-class feature. And then you enable teams to use this effectively, so they know where to get started, how to get most out of it, and how to progressively enhance their personalization strategy. There's a lot to it. Lars, our co-founder, CEO, even has a board game on personalization, which is fun. So yeah, there's a lot to it. And DXPs, this is prior generation of tooling where you have one big monolith running the show, running content management, rendering, delivery, and personalization, pretty much responsible for everything. And that's not working anymore in the composable Jamstack world. So this is DXC. I would say this is the evolution of DXPs.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it in comparison to DXPs. When you're describing it, and because it's being done at the edge, is it possible to use this approach, or Uniform specifically, on top of a site that isn't built headlessly? Let's say somebody says, I've got a legacy site, I want to incorporate a new data set into it, but I'd love to use Uniform to start that process.
Yeah, this is how we actually started the product as a set of painkillers and accelerators for existing DXP solutions. We have these fairly niche capabilities, but they solve concrete problems for customers running Sitecore, for example. So we're essentially able to Jamstackify their existing sites running on ASP.NET, essentially turn them into static sites that are also personalizable at the CDN level. So you can extend your lifetime of current investment, you can make sure these sites scale, and then you can incrementally modernize and go embrace composable and headless and Jamstack and almost take page by page approach if you wanted to, of moving off to React, to Next.js, and sunsetting the previous architecture. So that's the origin of Uniform, as we had a few of these painkillers that kind of realized there is a bigger problem to solve here. But this is how we started with a few of those.
Yeah, that's really compelling. Last year's Jamstack conference, I remember hearing a lot of this. Something with customers on our platform have done, where don't do a big bang rewrite to the Jamstack. You can do it incrementally, page by page. We sometimes call it progressive migration, or reference Martin Fowler's strangler pattern is a good kind of example of this, where you strangle out the legacy monolith gradually. Definitely for a large enterprise, it's too risky to migrate the whole site, but prove it out on a small site and then show people the productivity wins, and then everyone wants to roll it out to more of the sub properties. We're almost coming up at the top of the hour. The question I want to maybe close out with, if we don't have any other audience questions, is, it's Jamstack Conference 2022. In a year, it'll be Jamstack Conference 2023. What's your wish list or prediction for what we'll be seeing at Jamstack Conference 2023? Is something you want to see or something you're predicting we'll see?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think the framework wars will probably continue, so I'm not sure where that's gonna bring us in 2023, but we're gonna need to see. I'd love to see the data from Jamstack survey and see how things are either consolidating or not in that space, but it seems like there are still multiple camps at play here. I'd love to get, I guess, more different frameworks featured, maybe bring folks from Nuxt and Remix into the space. I think it'll be quite interesting to have a conversation of how things are evolving, but I don't know. This is the big question, how the multi-framework landscape is gonna evolve. I'm not sure. Anybody has any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's actually, I would say, like we had talked earlier about like the top themes of the conference. I would say the other one was the framework wars. In fact, we had a panel on it, and Scott and I were chatting, and there were a bunch of frameworks up there. There was Solid, there was Astro.
No React, though, interestingly enough.
There was and Redwood.js wasn't up there. It was one of the ones we noticed was missing. So yeah, you're right, there were no React frameworks up there, now that I think about it. Astro's kind of a meta.
Astro's not a React framework.
Yeah, you can use React with Astro.
Yeah, Astro is not as a React framework.
But you're right, there were no React frameworks up there. That's a very interesting observation. I can't believe I
something
totally
a React
that.
framework developer might make.
Yeah.
And I thought it was fine, because the point they were trying to make is that they're moving beyond React. That's what they were saying without saying it. Yep. So I feel like they could say it more explicitly.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think you're right. There was talk of a post-React world, but certainly people have been talking about in the last couple months. It's been picking up in the blogosphere. It'll definitely be interesting to see how this sorts out in the next year, although I don't think it'll be completely sorted out. I'm curious to see how it progresses. It's definitely a fascinating space. Anthony, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. Your prediction for how that sorts out in the next year.
Just like the framework wars themselves.
Yeah, or what you want to see from Jamstack Conference 2023.
I would say what I saw in Jamstack 2022, the headline of the entire survey was Jamstack developers go full stack. Who have you heard say that before? So that was cool. I feel like it just feels like a whole.
If only there was a podcast that had a name, full stack Jams. Yeah. Sorry.
So I feel like the literal thesis they led with was the thesis we spent 2 years saying. So that was cool. Like, I couldn't be happier about that. And Yeah, I would just say, I think what Fred said, that what he's most excited for is stealing whatever Ryan is doing, and then Ryan saying he's stealing whatever Tanner is doing. There's a lot of wisdom in that.
I want them to steal what Quick is doing, but
Quick
and
is
get rid
also
of
stealing what they're
hydration.
doing. That's
Yes.
the most interesting two stealing is Quick and Solid right now. That's
Yes.
what I
Oh
said
yeah.
on the modern web.
Yeah. But I think the frameworks will be interesting in 2023. Since we're coming up a little over the top of the hour, I want to thank those of us who've stayed, especially Brad. I know you're in a difficult time zone and it's getting late, folks. We're losing our space. I've had to migrate 3 or 4 different locations to
We
broadcast
need to
from.
each on a room next time.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, they keep disassembling every room I go into. But we're looking forward to covering Jamstack Conference 2023 and seeing you guys all next year.
Absolutely. It'll be fun. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. Scott, you want to take us out?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today, tonight, this evening. It's been fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much to Alex for hanging out with us and joining us to talk about Uniform and several other things, including obviously Jamstack Conference. Thank you for Ishan for co-hosting this and asking all the awesome questions, as always. Very thought-provoking things. So we love it. Anthony, thanks for joining us up here as well. And Brad, yeah, thanks for hanging out, dude. As always, for real. Yeah. Appreciate everybody. And we will not be doing our normal thing tomorrow. We'll be traveling. But as far as next week goes, we will be going live. That was interesting. Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So don't forget to join us for that. Yeah. Thank y'all so much. Appreciate it. And if you're listening to the recording, be sure to give us a follow as well. And you know what? If you got any value from any of the speakers up here, please follow them too. Because if you got value from them here, you're probably going to get value from them elsewhere too. Y'all, thank you so much. We're going to wrap this up, head down and networks with some folks. If you missed it, if you didn't, you're here. And we'll see you next year. Oh, I totally did not mean to do that. That was amazing. All right. See you guys. All right. The fade was a little fast on that, but thank y'all so much. And we'll see you next time. Peace.